The slap echoed through the 42nd floor before anyone had time to breathe. Serafina Vale, chief executive of Vale Meridian Holdings, stood with her hands still raised, her chest rising and falling, her eyes fixed on the woman in front of her. Quinn, her executive assistant, pressed a palm against her own reddened cheek, too stunned to speak. The boardroom had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that presses against the ears louder than any shout could. Serafina's hand lifted a second time, ready to strike again, when a grip closed around her wrist midair. It did not shake. It did not hesitate. A man she barely recognized had crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped her cold. He was not one of the directors seated at the long glass table. He was not an executive, not a lawyer, not anyone whose name appeared on the payroll list that mattered. His name was Calder Voss, a contract technician responsible for the building's operational systems, a man who kept to himself, who fixed what was broken and left before anyone thought to thank him. He had been in the room only because of a flickering circuit panel behind the presentation screen, a problem nobody had expected to matter. Now his hand was wrapped around the wrist of the most powerful woman in the company, and he was not letting go. Serafina turned on him with fury sharpened by humiliation. Nobody touched her. Nobody interrupted her. Least of all a man in a gray uniform shirt with a tool belt slung over one shoulder. She demanded he release her, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade drawn from its sheath. Calder's answer came low, and even without a trace of fear in it, he told her he would let go after she lowered her hand. Not before. She asked if he understood who she was, as though the question alone should be enough to end the confrontation. He told her plainly that he understood exactly what he had just seen, a woman about to strike someone who had no way to defend herself. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The directors around the table sat frozen, unwilling to intervene, unwilling even to look away. Serafina's arm trembled, not from exertion but from something closer to disbelief. She was not used to resistance, and certainly not from a man whose position in the building ranked somewhere beneath every name in the room. Calder released her wrist only when her hand finally dropped, and he stepped back without another word, his expression unreadable, his posture calm in a way that unsettled her more than any argument could have. She stared at him, anger and confusion tangled together in her expression, before turning and walking out of the boardroom without another glance at Era. Calder remained behind for a moment, checking that the young assistant was unharmed before returning to the panel he had been repairing, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. What he did not know was that the security camera mounted above the door had captured the entire exchange, every second of it, from the first raised hand to the final retreat. And what no one in that room realized, not even Serafina herself, was that one person, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, had watched Calder's face during those tense seconds and noticed something the others had missed entirely. He had not flinched. He had not been afraid of her for even a single instant. And in a building where fear of Serafina Vale governed nearly every decision made, that alone made him worth watching. The elevator ride down from the 42nd floor felt longer than usual for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Directors avoided each other's eyes. Assistants pretended to check messages on phones they were not actually reading. Nobody wanted to be the first to say out loud what they had just watched, because saying it out loud would mean admitting that the woman who signed their paychecks had nearly struck a subordinate twice in front of an entire room, and that a stranger in a maintenance uniform had been the only one with the nerve to stop her. By the following morning, whispers had already begun moving through the hallways, though none of them carried Calder's name correctly, and none of them captured what had truly happened. He arrived at his usual hour, badge scanned at the service entrance, tools checked out from the maintenance office, his routine unchanged despite the storm he had walked into the day before. Calder Voss was 41 years old, a single father raising his daughter alone, a man who had built his entire life around avoiding exactly the kind of spectacle he had found himself at the center of. He did not wear expensive suits. He did not linger in conversations that might lead to attention. He showed up on time, did his work without complaint, and left before the evening crowd filled the elevators, because somewhere across the city a 10-year-old girl was waiting for him to walk through the door. There was something about him that did not fit the role he currently occupied, something the other technicians noticed but never quite named. He read blueprints and system reports faster than anyone expected from a contractor. He understood security architecture in ways that went well beyond wiring and access panels. Once, in passing, a junior IT staffer had mentioned his name to a department head, only to be met with a strange pause, as though the name meant something the department head could not quite place. Calder never explained himself, and nobody pressed him for details, because the unspoken rule in every workplace is that a quiet man is usually left alone. What almost none of them knew was that Calder had once stood on the other side of rooms exactly like the one he had walked into the day before. Years earlier, he had built a career as an enterprise risk consultant, the kind of specialist companies hired when something dangerous was hiding inside their own numbers. He had a gift for finding what others missed, for tracing a single irregular transaction back through months of carefully disguised paperwork until the truth came apart at the seams. That career ended abruptly after an internal scandal at the firm where he worked, a scandal that cost people their reputations and, in Calder's case, cost him his appetite for that entire world. He walked away from boardrooms and expense accounts and chose instead a life defined by simplicity, one where nobody could use power to crush someone weaker without him being close enough to stop it. Serafina summoned him to her office before noon. She sat behind her desk with her hands folded, composed again, every trace of yesterday's fury replaced by cold control. She informed him that his conduct in the boardroom had been unacceptable, that a contractor did not lay hands on an executive under any circumstance, and that she expected an apology before this matter escalated any further. Calder listened without interrupting, and when she finished he offered no apology at all. He told her, in a voice free of malice, that she held the authority to run an entire corporation, but that authority did not extend to striking another human being. Serafina's jaw tightened. She had expected him to fold the way everyone eventually folded in her presence, and his refusal to do so left her searching for her next move. She reminded him that men had lost far more than a maintenance contract for less than what he had done, that a single phone call from her could end his ability to find work anywhere in the city. Calder absorbed the threat without flinching, and when he answered, his voice remained as level as it had been from the very first moment he grabbed her wrist. He told her that he had built a life once around exactly the kind of power she was describing, and he had walked away from it deliberately, so her threat carried less weight with him than she assumed it would. Serafina studied him for a long moment, trying and failing to locate the fear she expected to find in a man threatened with the loss of his livelihood. Her office was the kind of room designed to remind visitors exactly how far below her they stood. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over a skyline she had once found intimidating and now barely noticed. A single framed photograph of her father sat angled on the shelf behind her desk, positioned so that anyone sitting across from her would see his eyes as well as hers. Calder noticed the photograph immediately, though he said nothing about it. She began drafting the words to terminate his contract on the spot, the kind of decision she made a dozen times a year without a second thought. Before she could finish the sentence, Calder placed a slim folder on the edge of her desk, unhurried, deliberate. He told her that before she dismissed him, she should read what was inside. Serafina's hand hovered over the folder, uncertain whether curiosity or suspicion had stopped her. But something in his steady gaze convinced her to open it. Inside were printouts of system logs, timestamps, and access records that told a story entirely different from the one she believed the day before. The financial report that had triggered her fury, the one she blamed on Era's supposed carelessness, had in fact been altered after it left her hands. The edits had been made using credentials belonging to someone with far greater access than any assistant possessed, someone positioned high enough in the company that nobody would think to question their movements. Serafina read the pages twice, her expression shifting from disbelief to something colder and more focused. Her thoughts turned immediately to Dorian Kessler, the company's chief operating officer, a man in his late 40s whose composure never wavered, whose loyalty to her had seemed unshakable through every difficult year since she inherited the company. Dorian had stood beside her when the board doubted whether a woman in her 30s could run a corporation her father built from nothing. He had defended her decisions in meetings where others hesitated, and for years she had trusted him more than almost anyone else inside those walls. It was precisely that trust which made the possibility now forming in her mind so difficult to accept. She asked Calder where he had obtained the data, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier command. He answered simply that it came from the very systems she paid other people to protect, systems that had clearly failed her, whether through negligence or design. There was no triumph in the way he said it, no attempt to leverage what he knew into anything for himself. He did not ask for a reward. He did not request a promotion or a formal apology. He simply stood there, waiting to see whether she would choose to look away from an inconvenient truth or face it directly. Before he left her office, Calder told her something that unsettled her more than the folder itself. This was not the beginning of the problem, he said. Someone had been quietly dismantling the company from within for the better part of 8 months, moving carefully enough that no single incident had ever been enough to raise an alarm on its own. Serafina sat in silence long after he closed the door behind him, staring at a name she had trusted for years, wondering how much of what she believed about her own company had ever been true. She spent that entire evening alone in her apartment, the folder spread across the kitchen table where she rarely ate, tracing the same lines of data over and over, as though repetition might reveal a different answer than the one already staring back at her. She thought of every closed-door conversation she had shared with Dorian, every late-night strategy session where his calm voice had steadied her nerves before a difficult board vote. She had built entire decisions around his counsel. The possibility that his counsel had never been loyal at all sat in her stomach like something swallowed too quickly. Over the following days, the balance between them shifted in ways neither had anticipated. What began as a woman summoning a contractor to be reprimanded slowly became something closer to a partnership neither of them would have chosen voluntarily. Calder uncovered a pattern of high-value contracts routed through intermediary firms that existed on paper but produced nothing of substance. Several of those firms traced back to addresses connected to members of the executive board, though the connections were buried under enough layers of paperwork that only someone with Calder's particular skill would have found them at all. Dorian appeared in an unusual number of these meetings, always calm, always reasonable, always positioned exactly where he needed to be to steer conversations away from uncomfortable questions. The investigation moved slowly at first, the way most quiet things move inside a building trained to notice only what makes noise. Calder worked through the evenings, when the offices had mostly emptied, cross-referencing vendor payments against contracts that had never been fully executed, building a picture piece by piece, the way he once had for corporations far larger than Vale Meridian. He kept everything on paper rather than in digital files, a habit left over from his old career, one that made it far harder for anyone to erase what he found with a single keystroke. Era approached Calder privately one afternoon, her voice hesitant, her eyes carrying the weight of something she had carried alone for too long. She apologized for having once dismissed him as nothing more than building staff, admitting that she had misjudged him the way most people in the company likely had. Then she told him something she had never shared with anyone. Months earlier, she had overheard Dorian instructing a junior analyst to adjust certain figures before a filing deadline, framing it as a routine correction rather than anything improper. She had been afraid to question a man of his seniority, afraid that raising concerns would cost her the position she had worked years to earn. Her silence, she admitted, had allowed something larger to continue unchecked. The relationship between Calder and Serafina did not soften into anything gentle, not yet. Their exchanges remained sharp, layered with a tension neither of them fully understood. She was not accustomed to a man who refused to bend to her authority, and he was not interested in becoming another voice inside her orbit of quiet obedience. Yet something had begun to change beneath the friction. In one conversation, she asked him directly whether he made a habit of standing against people who held power over others. He told her no. She pressed further, wanting to know why he had chosen to stand against her that day in the boardroom. His answer landed with more weight than she expected. That day, he said, she had forgotten that she was still a human being, not merely a title behind a desk. Serafina held his gaze longer than she intended to, and for the first time since the slap that had brought him into her life, she did not see a technician standing across from her. She saw someone who had not lied to her once, in a building full of people who rarely told her anything close to the truth. There was a night that week when both of them stayed far past the hour anyone else remained in the office, reviewing spreadsheets under the low glow of a single desk lamp because neither wanted to risk being overheard elsewhere in the building. Somewhere near midnight, Serafina asked him, almost carelessly, whether his daughter minded the long hours his work sometimes demanded. Calder's expression softened in a way she had not seen before. He told her his daughter was the reason he kept every promise he made, the reason he had chosen a life small enough that nobody could ever use her against him. Serafina said nothing in response, but something in the admission settled quietly between them, changing the shape of whatever this had become. To confirm what they suspected, Calder and Era devised a quiet test, working without informing anyone beyond the three of them. Serafina pretended to remain unaware of the investigation, continuing her public routine as though nothing had changed, while behind closed doors she authorized Calder to plant a single false document into the system, one containing fabricated details about an upcoming acquisition. Only 4 people held clearance to view that particular file, and Dorian was one of them. If the false information surfaced anywhere outside the company, they would know precisely who had leaked it and to whom. Within hours, the fabricated document appeared on an external server, exactly as they had hoped and feared in equal measure. Calder traced its path methodically, following digital footprints until they led him to a law office quietly retained by Dorian for matters he had never disclosed to the board. The proof was no longer circumstantial. It was direct, traceable, and damning. Serafina read the trace report twice before setting it down on her desk and staring out at the city lights for a long while without speaking. Somewhere in that skyline was the law office Calder had identified, ordinary and unremarkable from the outside, indistinguishable from 1,000 other offices where nothing suspicious was supposed to be happening. She thought about how many years she had shared meals with Dorian, how many times she had defended him to skeptical directors, and how easily all of it had apparently meant nothing to him at all. Then the situation shifted in a direction none of them had prepared for. Serafina received an urgent call from the board of directors, their tone leaving no room for negotiation. They demanded that she suspend Calder immediately, terminate Era for what they called repeated procedural failures, and hand over every piece of the internal investigation directly to Dorian, whom they still regarded as the most trustworthy executive in the building. Serafina found herself standing at the edge of an impossible choice, torn between a man she had known and relied upon for years and a man she had known for only a matter of weeks but who had proven again and again that he was telling her the truth. She walked into the small office where Calder had been working late into the evening and told him plainly that by morning he would be arrested. He did not react with panic or protest. He only asked her one question in return, quiet and direct. Had she decided who she believed? She answered honestly that she had not decided yet, and the admission cost her more than she expected it to. What followed placed Calder in the most vulnerable position he had occupied since walking away from his old career. He was accused of stealing confidential corporate data, the accusation supported by security footage that had been carefully edited and by files on his work computer that had clearly been planted by someone with far greater access than he possessed. The evidence against him was convincing enough that even those inclined to trust him began to hesitate. Dorian visited him under the pretense of offering help, his voice smooth with false sympathy. He told Calder that fighting the accusation was pointless, that men without resources rarely won against men who controlled entire institutions, and that if Calder simply confessed to a lesser version of the charges, he would personally ensure a lighter outcome. Calder looked at him without any trace of the fear Dorian had clearly expected to find. He told him plainly that this offer had nothing to do with saving him. When Dorian asked what he thought this was truly about, Calder answered without hesitation that Dorian wanted him gone, erased quietly enough that nobody would ever ask the right questions again. Under mounting pressure from the board, Serafina was forced to sign the order suspending Calder's contract, though she had not yet gathered enough proof to protect him publicly. Her hand shook slightly as she signed it, something the assistant standing nearby noticed but knew better than to mention. She had signed hundreds of documents in that same chair over the years without a second thought, and this single signature felt heavier than all of them combined. He did not plead with her to reconsider. Instead, he handed her a small storage device before he left the building, saying nothing beyond a simple request that she watch it when she had time alone. That night, in the quiet of her office, Serafina inserted the device and watched an old recording come to life on her screen. It showed Calder, years younger, seated in a conference room belonging to one of the largest corporations in the country, speaking with confidence and authority to executives twice his current seniority. She recognized the logo displayed behind him instantly, the same corporation that had once attempted a hostile takeover of Vale Meridian, long before she assumed control of the company. The man in that recording was not simply a technician who happened to understand computer systems. He had once been the person who exposed a fraud scheme worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a scandal so damaging it had reshaped an entire industry's approach to internal oversight. Serafina sat motionless in front of the screen for a long time, trying to reconcile the composed man from the video with the quiet contractor who had spent weeks fixing wiring panels in her building without ever mentioning any of it. When she finally saw him again, she asked him directly who he truly was. His answer was simple and devastating in its implications. He was the man Dorian had spent years trying to erase from the company's history altogether. Neither of them slept much that night. Calder sat in the small apartment he shared with his daughter, listening to her breathing through the thin wall between their rooms, wondering whether the life he had built so carefully to protect her was about to come apart because he had chosen once again not to look away from something wrong. He had told himself for years that walking away from his old career meant walking away from danger entirely. He understood now that danger did not require a boardroom on the 40th floor of a downtown tower. It only required someone willing to look the other way, and he had never been that person. Serafina was not the only one carrying secrets inside those walls. Long before she became chief executive, she had been a young woman standing in the shadow of a father whose name still hung over every decision she made. Magnus Vale had built the company from nothing, and after his sudden death, Serafina inherited not only his empire but the weight of proving she deserved it. The board had never fully accepted her, viewing her for years as little more than the founder's daughter placed in a chair too large for her. To silence that doubt, she had hardened herself into someone unwavering, someone who never allowed weakness to show, someone whose reputation for coldness had become both her armor and her prison. Her greatest error, she now understood, had been placing absolute faith in Dorian Kessler. He had stood beside her through the hardest years of her transition into leadership, defending her in meetings where others hesitated to support a young woman claiming authority over grown men who had worked for her father for decades. That loyalty, real or performed, had made it nearly impossible for her to imagine him capable of betrayal. In a rare, unguarded moment, Calder told her something she had not expected to hear from him. He said she was not a cruel person, despite the reputation she had cultivated. She looked at him sharply, insisting that he did not know her well enough to make that judgment. He answered that he did not need to know every detail of her life to recognize a pattern he had seen before, a person determined to prove her own strength who slowly begins mistaking fear in others for respect. Serafina admitted something then that she had never said aloud to anyone inside the company. She confessed that she did not know how to lead without becoming the very image of her father that she had once resented, a man who ruled through intimidation because he believed nothing else would hold an empire together. Calder asked gently whether it was her father she was describing. She nodded, and for the first time since he had known her, her composure cracked just enough to reveal the exhaustion beneath it. From that point forward, something between them shifted permanently. Serafina began trusting Calder not because he had proven himself useful, but because he had proven himself honest in a place where honesty had become rare. Calder, in turn, began to understand the pressures that had shaped her into the woman who once raised her hand in that boardroom, without excusing the act itself. They were no longer simply an executive and a contractor caught in an uncomfortable arrangement. They had become allies bound by a shared enemy and a growing, reluctant trust neither had anticipated. It was during this fragile new understanding that Calder uncovered the final piece of the scheme. A transaction scheduled to finalize the very next morning. If it went through as planned, Vale Meridian would lose control of its own governance entirely, absorbed quietly into a structure designed by people who had spent months working to make that outcome look inevitable. Night fell over the building as the deadline approached, the offices emptying floor by floor until only a handful of lights remained lit above the city. Serafina, Calder, and Era stayed behind long after everyone else had gone home, working against a clock that offered no mercy. The board had already revoked their system access earlier that evening, a final attempt to cut them off before the transaction could be stopped. Calder used knowledge few people possessed to force open a portion of the company's servers that had been sealed against them. Era worked in parallel, recovering deleted correspondence that Dorian had believed permanently erased, message after message revealing the true scope of what he had built over the preceding months. Serafina, meanwhile, prepared to face the board directly through an emergency video conference, knowing this confrontation would determine whether she remained in control of the company her father had built or lost it entirely to men who had spent years waiting for exactly this opportunity. Dorian appeared on the call with practiced calm, declaring to the assembled directors that Serafina had lost control of the organization and could no longer be trusted to lead it. The board, many of whom had already been quietly persuaded in private conversations over recent weeks, began preparing to remove her from her position before the night was over. Outside the windows, the city carried on as though nothing inside that building was unraveling at all, taxis moving through wet streets, distant lights blinking on and off in offices where other people's ordinary problems continued without interruption. Inside, 3 people worked against a silence that felt heavier with every passing minute, aware that whatever they found before sunrise would determine whether the company survived the morning intact or fell permanently into hands that had spent months preparing to catch it. In the final hour before the transaction could execute, Calder found the detail that unraveled everything. Dorian had not simply been diverting funds through shell companies for personal gain. He had deliberately engineered a decline in the company's value, manipulating contracts and disclosures to make Vale Meridian appear far weaker than it truly was, setting the stage for his associates to acquire it at a fraction of its worth once the board forced Serafina out. Serafina stood before the board with the weight of that knowledge behind her. When Dorian asked whether she intended to resign, she allowed a long pause to settle over the call before answering. She agreed to step down, and for a brief moment satisfaction flickered across his expression. Then she added that before she left, there was something the board needed to see. On the screen behind her, documents and communications began appearing one after another, each piece exposing the architecture of Dorian's scheme in unmistakable detail. Dorian's composure faltered as the evidence filled the screen, though he attempted one final display of confidence, asking whether she truly believed a single recording could save her position. Calder stepped forward then, placing a physical folder on the table in front of the camera. His voice was steady as he told Dorian that the recording was never meant to be the thing that saved her. Inside the folder were signed authorizations, transaction histories, and legal documentation that left no room for interpretation or denial. Dorian could not explain away digital signatures bearing his own credentials, timestamps that matched precisely with the moments he claimed to have been elsewhere, and financial trails that led directly back to accounts under his control. The directors, who moments earlier had been prepared to remove Serafina from power, now turned their full attention toward the man who had spent months manipulating them all. Era stepped forward as well, finally free to share what she had witnessed months before without fear of losing everything for speaking the truth. Her account, combined with the documentation Calder had assembled, left the board with no path forward except to acknowledge what had actually taken place inside their own company. Dorian made one last attempt to shift the narrative, turning toward Serafina with a bitter edge in his voice, asking whether she genuinely trusted her position to a man who had walked in off the street as nothing more than a technician. Calder answered simply that trust had never been the point. Serafina spoke next, her voice calm and unwavering, as she told the board plainly that her confidence rested not on any single person but on evidence that could not be argued away. One of the older directors, a man who had sat on the board since before Serafina was born, leaned toward the microphone and asked quietly how long Dorian had been permitted to operate this way without anyone noticing. Nobody answered immediately. It was Era who finally spoke, her voice trembling only slightly, explaining that the silence around men like Dorian was rarely an accident. It was built deliberately and patiently out of every person too afraid to speak first. As the truth settled fully into the room, everything Dorian had built over the preceding months collapsed at once. He had falsified reports to conceal his activity, attempted to place the blame for his own manipulation onto an assistant who had done nothing wrong, and worked to have an innocent man arrested simply to remove him from the equation entirely. Serafina walked toward Dorian, and for a moment it seemed as though history might repeat itself, that she might raise her hand the way she had once raised it against someone who never deserved it. She did not. Instead, she told him quietly that power did not grant anyone the right to strike another person, the same principle Calder had spoken to her weeks earlier in that very boardroom. Then she turned to Calder and admitted, in front of everyone present, that she finally understood why he had stopped her hand that day. Calder told her she still had the chance to make things right. She asked whether he believed she had not already begun. Standing in front of the board that had once doubted her and the man who had once challenged her, Serafina turned to Era and offered a public apology, acknowledging the harm she had caused and the trust she had broken. It was, in many ways, the truest measure of how far she had come since the day her hand had struck someone who could not strike back. Later that night, after the board members had logged off and the offices had emptied entirely, Serafina found Calder gathering his things near the maintenance office where he had first been assigned. She asked whether he truly intended to leave now that the crisis had passed. He said nothing at first, the silence stretching between them long enough to feel like its own kind of answer. She told him that this time she wanted to try to convince him to stay. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that night reshaped the company from the inside out. Dorian was removed from his position entirely and faced a formal legal investigation into the fraud he had orchestrated, his reputation collapsing as quickly as the empire he had tried to build behind Serafina's back. Era was fully reinstated, her judgment and integrity finally recognized by the same leadership that had once dismissed her without a second thought. The board, forced to reckon with how easily they had nearly handed control of the company to the very person responsible for its decline, acknowledged publicly that Serafina's decisions had ultimately saved the organization from ruin. New internal policies were introduced to prevent any single executive from wielding unchecked authority over financial reporting again, a direct response to everything Calder had uncovered. Serafina herself changed in ways visible to everyone who worked alongside her. The coldness she had relied upon for years began to soften into something steadier, a leadership style built less on fear and more on accountability. She no longer needed intimidation to command respect, because she had finally proven to herself, as much as to anyone else, that strength and cruelty were not the same thing. Calder refused every attempt to reward him in the ways the company understood reward. He wanted no substantial bonus, no executive title, no corner office overlooking the city he had spent years quietly avoiding. All he wanted was the same simple life he had built for himself and his daughter before any of this began. Serafina offered him instead a position as an independent advisor on corporate risk and ethics, a role that would allow him to use everything he knew without forcing him back into the world he had walked away from years earlier. He declined at first, unwilling to trade the quiet stability he had fought so hard to protect. They sat across from each other in a small cafe 2 blocks from the office, a place Calder had chosen specifically because nobody from the company ever went there. Serafina had never eaten in a place so ordinary, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind it at all. The coffee was too strong and the tables wobbled slightly, and none of it mattered because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was having a conversation with someone who wanted nothing from her except honesty. She asked him whether he intended to keep running from power for the rest of his life. He told her that he did not run from power itself, only from people who believed power made them larger than everyone around them. She considered this for a moment before asking what he would do if the person holding that power understood clearly and completely that she was no larger than anyone else in the room. Calder studied her for a long moment before answering quietly that perhaps under those circumstances he might consider staying after all. In time, Calder accepted the advisory role, though he kept his life outside the office exactly as private as it had always been. He came in only twice a week, always in the mornings, always gone before the building grew loud with the ordinary noise of business as usual. Era moved through the halls of the company without the fear that had once shadowed every interaction with her employer, and within a year she had been promoted to oversee the very department that once treated her as expendable. Serafina led with a steadiness that no longer depended on intimidation to hold her position secure, and the directors who had once questioned whether a founder's daughter could carry the weight of the company now spoke of her decisions with a respect they had withheld for years. Dorian's legal troubles unfolded slowly over the following months, the kind of process that moves without drama despite the size of what it eventually uncovers. Investigators found accounts in 3 different names, transfers routed through countries chosen specifically because they made questions difficult to ask, and enough evidence to ensure that the confident, composed man who once stood beside Serafina in every difficult meeting would spend a very long time explaining himself to people far less patient than she had been. He never contacted her again, not even to protest his innocence, which told her more about his guilt than any document ever could. Word of what happened inside Vale Meridian never became public spectacle, exactly as Calder preferred it. There were no headlines, no interviews, no attempt to turn a corporate reckoning into a story told outside the walls where it happened. The people who needed to understand what took place understood it fully, and that was enough for him. His daughter never knew the details of what her father had done during those difficult weeks, only that he came home a little later some nights and a little more tired, and that afterwards something in him seemed to breathe easier than it had in years. One morning, months after the events that had upended the company entirely, Serafina stood in the same boardroom where everything had begun. She extended her hand toward Calder, and he looked at it for a long moment, both of them remembering exactly where they had started. She told him this time her hand was not raised to strike anyone. He asked, with the faint trace of a smile, what it was for instead. She answered simply that it was time to begin again. Calder took her hand, and the two of them stood together in the quiet morning light of a company neither of them had expected to change so completely. The man who had once walked into that building as nothing more than a contract technician became, in the end, the only person inside those walls willing to tell the most powerful woman in the company that she was wrong. And the woman who had once silenced an entire floor with a single act of cruelty finally learned that true strength in any room has never belonged to the person everyone fears, but to the one strong enough to admit when they have been mistaken.